So today we're going to be hearing from Andrew Leigh about his new book with Nick Terrell, Reconnected, a community builder's handbook. So Andrew Leigh is a federal member for FENA. Before he was elected in 2010, Andrew was a professor of economics at the Australian National University. And his previous books include Battlers and Billionaires, The Luck of Politics, and Randomistas, which sounds like a curious term, and perhaps Andrew can explain what that is. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Tristan. I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people in the ACT. I'd pay tribute to their elders, Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yongu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawal Wari, Dara Wari, Dindi, Wangerlin Jinyin, and acknowledge any Indigenous people on the call today. Tristan, it's a great honour to be speaking to you and your forum. I've been using social capital research since you founded it in 2004, which is the year I finished my PhD, working in part with Bob Putnam. And it was a valuable resource when I wrote the first book on social capital, Disconnected, in 2010. So when Fleur Creed reached out and said that you might be interested in talking, I was delighted to take up the invitation. 10 years on from Disconnected, Reconnected is less about the problem and more about the solution. But in order to justify why we need to have a civic renaissance in Australia, it's worth saying something about where the trends have gone. Since 1985, Australians have halved the number of friends that they have. They have halved the number of neighbours that they know. Since the beginning of the 1980s, the share of Australians who are in a union has fallen by 2/3. Since the 1950s, the share of Australians who attend a religious service has fallen by 2/3. Australians are less likely to volunteer, less likely to donate, less likely to join. And there's fewer associations for them to join. When we look at data from the Directory of Australian Associations, we find that there's only a quarter of the number of associations per person that there was in the late 1970s. We've seen a rise in the share of Australians who say that they don't trust politicians, and commensurately a rise in the share of Australians who spoil the ballot paper or fail to vote, even although we have compulsory voting in Australia. Political party membership has fallen significantly, and in fact there are more people on the waiting list to join the Melbourne Cricket Club now than there are members of all of our Australian political parties combined. We've also seen some particular niche challenges that I hadn't anticipated in 2010. The rise of smartphones, the invention of the iPhone and Android phones, Facebook, Twitter, and various other social media platforms has been accompanied by a significant worsening of the mental health of young Australians. In 2005, asked whether they were very stressed, 1/3 of Australian school students said yes. Now that number is up to a half. For teenagers, the problem seems to have worsened even more considerably, with a significant share of Australians now, Australian teens, saying that they experience depressive symptoms. And on the worst end, the suicide rate, youth suicide rates have risen since 2010, that period accompanying the smartphone. What we do in Reconnected, though, is not simply to outline the problem, it's to spend most of our time talking about the solution. We profile a whole lot of terrific Australian social entrepreneurs and try and draw out, Tristan, not just great stories, but also systematic patterns on what they're doing. And let me give you a flavour of some of those today. In Reconnected, we talk about the notion of cyber connecting, the importance of using technology in order to enable face-to-face connections. Yes, more Australians today say they're addicted to smartphones than to smoking, but there are also valuable ways of using these devices and apps in order to connect us. There's an organisation called Gather My Crew, which has set up a platform that allows people to reach out to a group of people to assist them. It's been used, for example, by people who have lost a spouse and find themselves juggling tasks. It allows users to assign the tasks that need doing, and then their crew steps in to fill them out. One woman who was at her wit's end populated the tasks before she went to bed, sent it out to her mother's group, and found that when she woke up in the morning, all of the tasks had been filled. Others are using technology in order to mobilise face-to-face connections. When coronavirus hit, the Australian press was filled by stories about people fighting over the last roll of toilet paper in the supermarket aisles. But at the same time, Catherine Barrett, a medical doctor, set up the Kindness Pandemic, a Facebook page that encouraged people to share stories of generosity, such as the stories of some people who were dropping off a cup of coffee to a neighbour who is struggling through homeschooling a number of young children. The Kindness Pandemic also mobilised its helpers to assist in other ways. So, for example, to step in and provide assistance online to expectant mothers whose antenatal classes had been cancelled. Astrid Jorgensen turned pub choir into couch choir, crowdsourcing songs from thousands of people in order to show that the power of singing hadn't been lost in the age of coronavirus. In Reconnected, Nick Terrell and I also talk about the idea of organisations which serve two purposes. We take George Orwell's Newspeak term, double plus good, and repurpose it to a more positive end. Organisations which are engaged in double plus good social capital include Greening Australia, which has initiated singles tree planting events, where you can improve the environment and potentially meet the love of your life. In the UK, the Good Gym allows people to register to go for a run on a Saturday morning to the home of an older person who's feeling lonely. Those older people are referred to as coaches because they're the people that get the runners out of bed in the morning. The runners might run 20 minutes to the home of someone who needs to have a chat. They'll come in, have a cuppa, and then they'll run back home. That's double plus good social capital because people are getting fit and staying connected at the same time. And the third concept I'll mention before opening it up to questions is the idea of Sutton's law of social capital. When he was asked why he robbed banks, infamous bank robber Willie Sutton said, "Well, I rob banks because that's where the money is." And in the same spirit, Nick Terrell and I think that if you want to build social capital, you need to build it where the need is. It's not much good simply assisting people who already have high levels of civic engagement to engage a little more. So we really admire organisations which are using sport to connect migrant youth into their communities. Soccer has been the best example of this, with a range of community entrepreneurs reaching out to new migrant communities and providing simple things like connections, soccer balls, uniforms. They don't cost a great deal, but they provide connections to people who have very few. We've also admired the way in which community entrepreneurs are reaching out to vulnerable Australians as volunteers. Mount Druitt Ethnic Community Services has a program of helping marginalised migrants, and they will often assist those migrants being volunteers in their own organisation. They recognise that a track record of volunteering can be really useful when it comes to searching out a job. And so they're putting Sutton's law of social capital in action by looking to assist the most vulnerable. We also admire Street, a cafe which is set up to assist homeless Australians and provide a sense of identity, employment and training. Street's founder, Beck Scott, is a wonderful inspiration and somebody who looks to try and auspice new innovative startups. Beck's not about just bringing everyone into Street. She wants Street to be a place where social entrepreneurs can build their own organisations. And she's assisted people who've been sleeping rough. One of the stories that Nick Terrell and I tell in Reconnected is about when she was one day accompanying a group of the people she was assisting to their first day of vocational training and training up to be a barista, to make coffees. And one of them was looking uncharacteristically nervous as he went into the building. Beck asked him why, and he pointed across to the park on the other side of the street and said, well, that's because that's where I used to sleep all last year. That assistance for the most vulnerable, that notion of Sutton's law of social capital is something that we found really inspiring. There's chapters in Reconnected that talk about how to boost donations, about how to encourage volunteering, about how to increase social activism, and about how to improve political engagement. As a federal member of parliament for the last 10 years, I'm really worried about the extent to which too many people see politics as a spectator sport. It's not. In politics, we're all on the field. We talk in Reconnected about some of the models for organising people, some of the interesting things that unions are doing, social campaigns such as the same-sex marriage campaign, and also the work that deliberative democracy is doing. And I held my first deliberative democracy exercise a couple of weeks ago in concert with Ohio State University and the University of Canberra. I'd be very happy to talk about the potential that I see for that. So there's lots of good things going on. We tell largely Australian stories, but we think that they've got application around the world. We've reached out to a whole lot of the scholars working in this space, but love to know what you're doing. We want to make this a live and lively conversation in which we're taking so much of the best of what people are doing to connect and putting it into action, in which we're learning the lessons of what works and just as importantly, figuring out what doesn't. People like Fleur were really important to us in understanding religious communities and looking at the innovative models as to what works and what doesn't in religious communities. So there's a whole lot we can do. It's a shared project. It's not something that can be left off to others. In fact, it would be ironic if the problem of connection could be solved by one person acting alone. Reconnection has to be a team sport, and we're keen to see it together. One final comment. Our book came out at just the same week as Robert Putnam and Shaylin Garrett produced The Upswing. And like them, we share the view that decreased connectedness is closely tied to rising inequality. Both are about societies moving away from being we societies of collective that value the collective towards being me societies that value the individual. Putnam and Garrett document really strikingly that this isn't just a trend that you see when you look at the data on group membership or the data on inequality. It's also something that you see if you look at books published every year. Books are much more likely now to contain words like I and me, and less likely to contain words like us and we. That's a trend which it has been in place for the past generation, holds for Australian books as it does for American books. So I think this is a big challenge that we're facing, and one that Tristan, I'm very glad we have people around the world thinking hard about.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Andrew. I might start with the first question. If anyone would like to pose a question and you don't feel like speaking, you feel free to put it into the group chat, and we'll read it out and get to that question. So you've mentioned about individualism really, and about the focus of society being more and more on I and on me. And it seems like this is really one of the big drivers towards the disconnection. And I'm sure this is something that you discussed in your previous book as well. So I guess my question is really what you see as being the biggest barriers. Like that seems to be lying at the heart of it, but what else is sort of sitting above, and what else is causing this drive towards individualism that is causing this disconnection and I guess decline in social capital?
Tristan, it's a great question. Let me first push back against one of the most common ideas that you hear in this space, which is that it's all the fault of neoliberalism, that we can't have strong competition, healthy markets, and a connected society. I don't think that's right. Certainly that doesn't seem to hold with my reading of history, but also it doesn't hold when you look around countries around the world. The most engaged countries are not typically the countries with least openness to markets. I think time and technology probably play more of a part. We're more time pressed than we were in the past, partly because of an increase in paid work, partly also because of an increase in commuting, and especially solo car commuting, which is particularly corrosive to social capital. And there's a range of impersonal technologies which have acted to make us less connected with one another. We're more likely to use ATMs than speak to a bank teller. We're more likely to scan our own groceries than speak to a checkout worker. We're more likely to be watching television, using smartphones, using tablets, and playing video games, which have sapped a very high share of time, particularly for non-working 20-something men. All of these technologies are ones which are going to be in place. Nick Terrell and I are not advocating that we go back to the world of the Luddites, hence cyber connecting, using technologies more mindfully, recognising that many of the scions of Silicon Valley are themselves very cautious about their own device use and that of their children. They understand that these devices are built by people that know the best research around the psychology of addiction, and that we shouldn't expect the typical 12-year-old to be able to fight against products designed by the world's best addiction specialists. So we need to be more mindful in how we use technology, and also recognise the sheer pleasure of a life lived with others. When we're lying on our deathbeds, I don't think we'll be thinking about, oh dear, I wish I'd spent another hour on Facebook. But we might be wishing we'd spend another hour with our friends.
So a follow-up before we hand over to other people for questions. The idea of disconnection, I think, is really coupled alongside a bit of a disconnection in public discourse, you know, where there's a lot of divisiveness and a lot of people tend to see issues as being black and white, and they tend to see things as this or that. And there seems to be a trend, particularly in the developed world, for a lot of people to have difficulty discussing these deeper issues and therefore shy away and pull away from meaningful conversation with other people that can result in, bridging divides in understandings. So, I mean, I guess I'd be interested to know whether you see that as being something that's happening, a trend and a problem, and I guess also whether you see any solutions to that problem.
It certainly is, Tristan, and socialising is a muscle. To figure this out, you only need to go to Manhattan, which is a place where people are living cheek by jowl and have just gotten used to the norms of friendly interactions. People in Manhattan are extraordinarily good at striking up a quick, friendly conversation with a stranger. Whether it's in a shop, whether it's on the subway, they've just gotten good at it because they do it so often. And the less often we socialise, the worse we get at it and the harder it feels. When I became a politician in 2010, I felt really uncomfortable walking up to a group of strangers and breaking into their conversation and making small talk. I don't have any problems doing that these days. It's not that I'm a different person, it's just I've had a whole lot more practice. There's an organisation called Befriend, started by a guy called Nick Maisie in Perth. And it was established after Nick received an email from a guy who he only knew distantly saying, "Hi, I don't have any friends. I wonder if you could help me." And so Nick sets up barbecues, movie nights, get-togethers, all pretty casual, but a pretty regular schedule, and tries to ensure that as people come in, increasingly they take ownership over the friend-finding business. And we need to keep on doing that. There's even a helpline called Friendline, which has been established to allow people to do this remotely. But making friends is one of the great pleasures in life, but that doesn't mean we're all very good at it. We can all become a little bit better at the business of making friends.
Anybody have any other questions? Just remember, you're all on mute, so before you ask a question, you'll need to unmute yourself.
May I ask a question then?
Sure.
Thanks for the opportunity. Good to actually hear from you, Andrew. Talking about social capital, I actually did my PhD over in Australia, and I actually picked up quite a few pointers from ANU during an XP course a few years ago. I think this was after you left the university. And what we do is actually measure and map out those connections between people. So that way, top management in organizations can actually see who actually has the greatest weight when you talk about social capital within the organizations. One of the interesting observations I've made is this. When we mentioned to the top management that, hey, this will actually make it clear to you that who's really connected to who, so that, you know, you can actually figure out if there's some possible hanky-panky happening in this particular cluster, if your people are actually in separated clusters, then they realize, hey, this is going to open a Pandora's box. Let's not do this. So that's so you're getting the gist of what I'm saying from based on the smile that I see on your face. So, you know, top management are worried if people can actually figure out how the organization actually works. I mean, this is important for politics, important for in organizations where there's some covert things happening. So it runs counter to what we collectively believe, that connectedness is important. How do we address this? Because a lot of these top management are those who are calling the shots. We've got to make it clear to them, look, having a clear picture as who's connected to who is actually useful for you. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. So how do we actually manage this particular issue? I'll appreciate if you could actually give us some pointers. Thank you.
I mean, it sounds as though you're working in a really interesting area, and I was smiling because as you were speaking, I was feeling some of that sense of discomfort. I don't mind the idea that you would have top management knowing who had the most friends or acquaintances or connections, but top management knowing all of the connections in the company, well, that starts to make me a little less comfortable, because perhaps some of those informal connections might be ones which the person would prefer to keep quiet, but you've got two-way disclosure, and so if you don't have to give yourself your friends up, your friends can give you up. It might be better to focus on to just focus on emphasising numbers of connections rather than patterns of connections. But the patterns are fascinating. Raj Chetty's team at Harvard has been doing a huge amount of work with large tax data sets. And they've just moved on to a collaboration with Facebook, where they have a whole lot of the Facebook data and looking at connections there, and trying to use that as a way of nutting out the impact of social capital on life chances, effectively to ask the question, how valuable are friends in providing a protective assistance, and also in helping you rise. Mark Granovetter's work on the strength of weak ties in job finding has been really influential, but it's a while since we've been able to update that. We have studies that look at the raw correlation between not having friends and dying young. We know that correlation is there, but it's not so obvious how much of it is causal and how much is simply that there's some third factor which is driving ill health and isolation at the same time. So I think there's an awful lot to be done. I think it's very clear that these connections matter, and all else equal, as an employer, albeit of a small team, I would always like staff who have more connections rather than fewer.
Thanks, Andrew.
There's a question in the chat from Jody about measurement. Andrew, do you have a preferred way or method to measure social capital?
Jody, I've always thought about this as being a pastiche of evidence, that we draw together a range of indicators. Friendships seem to be pretty important, which is why we commissioned 2 follow-up surveys. There'd been an initial survey done in 1985 as part of the National Social Science Survey. I managed to persuade one market research team to go out and field that again in 2006, and managed to persuade a different market research team to go out and refield it again in 2018. So that then gave 3 data points for measuring strength of friendships and neighbourly interactions. That's something which wasn't available in the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, but following up with those friendship surveys really matters. You've also seen a similar decline in friendships in the United States as well, finding that post-dated bowling alone. Group memberships matter. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has been doing this reasonably consistently since 2005, I think it is. And there's other bits and pieces you can put together. And the volunteering surveys go back a little further, although they're pretty patchy. You get on into more uneasy ground as you look at religious participation and union membership. Some see them as quintessential social capital. Others see them as outdated institutions. And so we include them, but we're aware that there's differing views. And for Disconnected, I went and surveyed a whole lot of large Australian organisations and asked them for their membership figures. Went back again for Reconnected and was able to get data for 12 organisations, which we put together into an index of membership, indexing the membership rates by the relevant population. So, for example, Girl Guides as a share of girls, Scouts as a share of boys, RSL members as a share of adults. So we plot a range of those series. Naturally, the critique of that can be made is, well, people are leaving old organisations and joining new ones. So you then need to supplement that with overall surveys which ask people, are you a member of any association? And to that, people are less likely to say yes than they were.
So this is clearly an area where we're attempting to measure at the macro level. And this is something where notoriously it's extremely difficult to get the sort of data that we need to be able to make a country-wide or statewide, region-wide comparison about what's happening with social capital. But it's a really significant challenge, and the way in which people tend to measure social capital at the sort of meso or group level, can be quite different, I think, to that, where there aren't the same sorts of challenges around actually getting the data.
Do you have favourite metrics, Tristan? You've been following this very, very closely.
I do. They're qualitative and they're really designed for the context. So I don't measure at the macro level, and I don't know how I would attempt to do so if I needed to, because of that problem of availability of data. And at the meso level, then I would really be designing a qualitative instrument for the context.
So are there any sort of favourite questions that you feel elicit aspects of social capital that are especially important?
I actually tend to, so I use the 3 dimensions, the structural, relational, cognitive dimensions, and then I actually develop the instrument for the context by asking the participants what they feel are important aspects of social capital. So there's a very big difference between, say, people who work in a production line in a factory. What they need might be feelings of solidarity and belonging to the organization, compared to someone who's working in technology development, where it's all about innovation and creativity, and they need those networks and those sort of weak bridging ties to other people to get information flows. So every person in an organization or in a group setting is going to have different sorts of requirements, and so I tend to like to pose it to them as to what sort of factors are most important to therefore be able to develop the instrument. And of course, as we know, social capital reinforces itself. So by asking them what's important, it focuses their attention on it. And we find that it immediately has an impact in actually improving the social capital in that context.
Yes, yes. One of the groups for which I found it hardest to measure social capital was Indigenous Australians, where there is different notions of family and different notions of volunteering. So we were able to present some evidence about participation in cultural practices, but it's not as extensive as I would have liked to have I think there's good research still stands to be done to look at not only aggregate trends across Indigenous communities, but also which ones have the strongest levels and why.
Yeah, and we actually recently had a presentation from Professor Ian Falk in the Northern Territory, who has been doing some research with Indigenous communities and social capital. And he expressed the same kind of sentiment, that the cultural differences really mean that what we value in a modern society compared to a more traditional society is quite different. So even the very concept of social capital maybe doesn't have so much applicability, you know, in that sort of cultural context. So the measure of it ends up being really potentially quite different.
Yes.
So I think there's another question in the chat, if we can get to that. Are you aware of any data on the social capital for marginalised groups? For example, people living with disability or young people exiting care. This is my area of focus. That's from Diana.
Yes, not specifically, Diana. We've certainly been able to identify that, as you would expect, social capital tends to be weaker in more marginalised groups. People with disabilities tend to have fewer social connections, to be less likely to be part of formal organisations. And that's particularly true in politics. We see a big gap in the share of affluent and less affluent, so a big gap between affluent and less affluent Australians in people's engagement on things such as, have you written a petition? Have you met with a politician? Do you know the name of your local politician? All of those sorts of metrics tend to be much lower in disadvantaged communities. There's less political social capital there.
Yeah, thank you. And I think from my perspective, what I've witnessed working in the not-for-profit sector for the last 20 years, you know, particularly for kids in care, children who might be living in residential care type environments, actually their social capital is their care team that wraps around them. And once they turn 18 and exit care, they bounce around a whole heap of systems because that's how they've learnt to live, and they've not been enabled to build those natural networks that then support them to be able to live well. And the statistics are dire. You know, very large proportions of young people in their first year of exit from care actually are homeless or experience at least one episode of homelessness. There's large proportions of those same young people that will have interaction with the justice system. And, you know, sort of my whole theory, I suppose, and where I'm heading towards is that if we can help them to build social capital, we actually can alleviate some of those greater impacts on their lives.
Yes, ideally you want a network of unpaid friends, don't you?
Yes.
So anybody else have any questions? Sophie has a question in the chat. What do you see the role of government in supporting and building social capital, or does it need to be ground up?
As somebody who's been in Parliament for the last 10 years, it would be strange if I didn't have any answers for government on this one. I certainly think that there's important roles in terms of improving laws around fundraising, in terms of making it better, making it more straightforward for non-profit agencies to access government support, and in terms of improving laws around superannuation bequests, around the way in which volunteers are managed, improving the platforms that allow people to donate. So, for example, having a single national platform for in-kind donations, I think would make a lot of sense. But there's also an awful lot to be done by individuals working directly in their communities. So this year, as we've done every year for the past decade, my wife and I will put on our annual street party. Many of you may well do this. If you don't, I'd encourage you to start this year, Victorians perhaps accepted. It's insanely easy to organise a street party. We take last year's invitation, we change the date. The acronym BYO ensures that we're not catering for everybody in the street, and then people turn up for an hour on a Saturday afternoon. We really like our neighbours, but we do it even if we hated them, because having those connections just makes it a more enjoyable street to live in. And that's not something that I think government could easily bring. I can't imagine government running all of the street parties in a neighbourhood. So a lot of the civic renaissance we need ought to be started by citizens. But there's things that government can do. I mentioned deliberative democracy before. That's a classic way in which governments can ensure that their decisions are informed by good community consultation, but also that they're empowering citizens to be part of the process. Deliberative democracy isn't just opinion polling the electorate. It's having people sit down, engage with the issues, engage with their fellow citizens, try and change the minds of one another, which is fundamentally what politics is about, and then come to a shared consensus. As Aristotle once said, politics is simply the art of living together. It's as simple or as difficult as that.
All right, anybody else have any other questions? I think depending on your perspective on social capital, like what sort of conceptual approach you take, quite often coordinating institutions are mentioned as being something that's really important to help to set the tone for the types of the trust that exists, the social trust, the types of norms that exist and the patterns of interaction between groups and between individuals. And I guess when we're thinking about coordinating institutions, there is no greater coordinating institution than the role of government. And so I guess, at that sort of top level, I wonder whether or not government can really do anything to try to influence these very broad, societal wide trends, and maybe try to reverse some of the things that are causing or have caused the increasing disconnection in society in a more strategic way. Do you think that's possible?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd love to see the Charities Commission in Australia playing more of a role of boosting charities and encouraging them to engage with one another. I hold a regular social entrepreneurs breakfast, and I'll often notice that the value of that has nothing to do with me. It's from social entrepreneurs getting together and forming a network and being able to help one another out. There's an important role for government in providing matching platforms. Volunteer matching engines are run by a range of different organisations, but having some degree of centralisation there makes some sense to me. And so I think there's important roles for government in removing blockages, providing platforms, and occasionally stepping in directly, as we do with social support to vulnerable Australians, where that's often accompanied by social connectedness. Australia has done very badly in terms of our handling of refugees on Manus and Nauru, and in some sense that's undercut the fact that we do very well in handling refugee flows from people who are coming from offshore coming from refugee camps overseas. And those people are met at the airport, they're taken back to an apartment, they're taken out to meet the neighbours, linked into English classes. It's a role of government that recognises that settling a refugee isn't just about cash, it's also about connections.
So any other questions? Well, I have lots more, but I don't want to dominate the floor. Anybody else? I'd like to just turn our attention to technology for a moment. So you discussed a little bit about the ways in which the use of technology, particularly social media, is creating quite a few social problems. There are some systems around the world, such as China's social credit system, that attempts to remove the anonymity associated with online and social interaction using technology, and basically hold people more accountable for their actions, with a view really to driving social capital building and more pro-social activities. There's a lot of criticism of China's system, but do you think there is some sort of a system or some sort of solution that could be implemented at the top level that may help to resolve some of the problems of technology and declining social capital?
Yes, Tristan, I'm less confident than you that the chief motivation of the Chinese government is building social capital. I think it's maintaining control. But that's not to say that the issue of anonymity isn't a double-edged sword. Anonymity is extraordinarily important if you're a dissident or somebody who wants to be able to speak out without repercussions at work. But it's also served as a shield for online trolls spreading the foulest forms of hate. I did host a podcast called The Good Life, Andrew Leigh in Conversation, and my next upcoming guest is Ginger Gorman, who wrote a book called Troll Hunting. Ginger talks about some of the trolls there that will deliberately seek out tribute pages for young people who've died by suicide and taunt the family. It's a particular weapon that is used against women and especially against minority women in order to silence those participants in the political and journalistic debate. So anonymity is something that we need to think very carefully about in order to make sure that we've got high degrees of civic engagement, because we know, online bullying is not rare. It's something that's been experienced by some 40% of Australians, similar share of Americans, and my guess is that it's much the same in places like New Zealand and Malaysia.
I think there's also varying degrees of anonymity as well. That there is the completely anonymous online user, but there's also the John Jones who can bully somebody and say very hurtful or invalid, incorrect, false things, and then simply just disconnect, walk away from the situation. There's no real fear of reprisal. There's no real fear of their own personal well-being or safety because of the ability to simply walk away, disconnect, and walk away from the device. And so I think this is where, there's some of those issues come in around, yes, protecting privacy, but also holding people accountable for their actions. And ideally in the real world, this would be something that would probably be done through social norms and social sanctions. But there doesn't seem to be any mechanism online that can replicate the same sort of social control mechanisms.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the points that Ginger makes is that we don't rely on social norms in order to keep our cars safe. We don't have a norm that you wear seatbelts. We have a requirement that every car has a seatbelt and an airbag and that people use them. And so she argues similarly there should be safety by design built into platforms and that the ability of, for example, the Christchurch shooter to use Facebook Live without any checks there and with the video left up for 29 minutes illustrates a problem not with social norms, but a problem with the way in which the platform is operating.
I'll just pause for a moment in case anybody else wants to chime in.
Yes.
I would. Sorry, you go.
No, please, Alice, go.
Okay, I just wanted to refer to the importance of whistleblowers being protected. For example, whistleblowers in China at the early stages of COVID-19 were not protected. And so whistleblowers inside courts and royal commissions may need the protection of anonymity to feel secure in giving evidence or in whistleblowing against actions at an official level.
Absolutely, Alice. No, I think that's another great example as to where anonymity serves a valuable social role. So we've got to have cases like that in mind when we weigh that up against the damage being done under the shield of anonymity by trolls.
And Jacob, did you have another question or follow-up comment?
A question which is on my mind for some time now is, I think Putnam raised the importance of events in the build-up of social capital. He raised the immediate importance of the Second World War for building up the social capital in the USA. How do you judge this role? Because if a lot of social capital is built up by major events which happen by chance, how important in relation to this is the contribution we can make voluntarily? I'm not so sure. You see, there's clearly something about this event thesis, but I'm not so sure how important these events are, and if there's any chance to create events by chance to enhance solidarity and so on.
Yes, Jacob, I think you're totally right about the empirical pattern. We see this in Australia with bushfires. We've seen it, as you point out, in the United States and other countries with World War II. There's a nice economics paper on an earthquake in Chile, and COVID has brought it to the fore. But droughts, fires, floods and wars doesn't feel like the strategy we ought to ideally pursue as social capital builders. We ought to be able to bring something else to the table apart from saying, well, wait for the next catastrophe and people will begin to connect with one another. And it's interesting too to see the difference in certain events. So World War II produces the greatest generation who go on to found a whole lot of the important institutions of community building in America. September 11 produces only a short-term upswing and then things go back to normal. And part of the difference there is the message from leaders. FDR's fireside chats were much more about bringing people together in a spirit of shared sacrifice. There was none of that from George W. Bush coinciding with September 11. The message was go out and shop, get back to normal. So the credo of individualism stayed strong through September 11. A sense of communitarianism was strengthened through World War II. And the challenge now, of course, with COVID is to make sure that we're not simply saying to everyone, go out and shop. That the message is you've been there for your neighbours. We've seen an upsurge in solidarity. We can see that very clearly out of the surveys. Now let's make lasting changes. So, for example, there's an organisation called Play for Lives, which when a whole lot of sporting competitions were cancelled in Australia, reached out to sports people to say, now, sub in and volunteer for local organisations who have shed older volunteers as a result of social distancing with coronavirus. But the aim of the founder of that organisation, Craig Foster, isn't simply to bring about a temporary change, it's to bring about a lasting recalibration of the relationship of sporting teams to their local communities, to have sporting teams continue to volunteer after the pandemic, and particularly to reset the relationship between professional sporting teams and their communities, which Craig, as a former Socceroo, thinks is really important in Australia, that our professional sporting teams have moved away from the communities they're meant to serve. They need to move back towards them again. So that's a long-winded way of saying that we need leadership to seize the moment. Otherwise, this will just be a temporary upsurge in civic connectedness before going back to the downward trend.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. But your question or your remark about leaders brought me to another question, which I would I think you might be the appropriate person since you're a politician too. How great are the chances for leaders to win with the build of social capital elections? Because you see, but if I look at social capital, I think Jeremy Corbyn did for Labour a very fine job. He built up the greatest Labour or Social Democratic Party in Western Europe. And of course, he had some problems with Brexit, and he had some problems with the spatial election system in the UK, which in Germany would have been another story. He would still have done fine. But he really lost the last vote. So sometimes I fear that building up social capital is a very long-term investment. So if you as a politician invest in this very long-term project, there will be results, but unfortunately only after you lost your elections, or only you are not the leader anymore?
Yes, I think that's a really astute point there, Jacob. You don't often see people going to elections promising to improve social capital. In part, this is because it's not the most euphonious term. We all love it, of course, but I'm not sure you'd put it on a flyer or a television ad. But there's an awful lot that governments can do to boost community through carefully calibrated local grants, particularly if they're focused on disadvantaged communities, through providing connections to organisations. Things like Friendline receiving national assistance, I think, would be totally appropriate. And there is a payoff, I think, for politicians, which comes before decades have elapsed, and that is that people like living in a society where they are more connected to one another. So a government which decides to give as much emphasis to social capital as to physical capital will quickly find that people enjoy being part of connection, enjoy being connected to others. As we know, there's such a thing as a helper's high. So boosting volunteering pays off in terms of people's sense of well-being. Encouraging opportunities for people to engage with one another, even through something like well-funded public transport networks, pays off in terms of community well-being. If people are happy with their lives, they're more likely to vote for the re-election of the government. It's not that hard.
I would partly agree with you, honestly. The thing is, yes, people like to live in a better connected society, and of course, some measures which you can take to raise social capital also produce visible outcomes in the short run, and people like and will reward that. But I don't know, Van Des, I once spoke to him and he told me the very clever sentence: people only mention social capital if they live in an environment where there's lacking social capital. And I think a big part of the neoliberal revolution, or even if you look at the disengagement of Generation Y, is that people take a bit social capital for granted. So they like the way they're connected, or they miss it, but the visibility is too small, and people don't really see that it's built up by purpose, and can be also decreased if we don't put our share or do the necessary things. So do you think there are some things to increase the visibility of the how necessary is to build up social capital, or to increase the visibility of the success if you have built up social capital?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to be going back to the 1950s. There is much to dislike about that more sexist, racist, homophobic time. But I think all successful political campaigns have some element of nostalgia in them, some sense that there are things we want to recapture from history. And so that is blended into a political campaign can be quite powerful. When you think about what was better about the 60s than today, you're struck by greater levels of equality and greater levels of community connectedness. So talking about how we'll reclaim those things while keeping the great benefits of a more enlightened, diverse, technologically engaged society. I think there's political power, that something like that seems politically tractable.
So Andrew, I'm aware that we're pretty short on time now. Have you got time for one or two more questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we've got one in the chat from Alice. Should social capital be included in national GDP? And I guess the question really is whether or not there's value in trying to track social capital, measure it and account for it on a national level.
So Tristan, I'd say yes to your question and no to Alice's. So let's measure it. Let's have accurate benchmarks of it. Let's try and ask consistent questions over time. One of my bugbears is statistical agencies that keep on changing the way in which they ask about social capital, so you can't get a good time trend. But no need to include it in GDP. GDP is what it is. It's not perfect, but it's trying to proxy the economic output of the nation. So let's leave that as one measure. Let's take social capital as another measure. And let's remember, as we teach all our economics students in the first day of class, that economics is about maximising well-being, not about maximising money.
Absolutely, that's a good point. Shall we have one last question, if there is one? Anybody got a final question? Doesn't sound like anybody else has a pressing question. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for your presentation and for making yourself available to chat with us today. I've certainly really enjoyed the conversation, and sort of conversation that we could continue ad infinitum, I suspect. You're welcome to join the Facebook group if you would like to get involved with the sorts of discussions that are going on, and we do tend to try to have fairly regular meetings as well, and discussion groups and webinars and that kind of thing. So we're seeing a few other thank yous coming through on the chat, and I'm sure everybody in the group and those who will watch it later, really thank you for your time.
Real pleasure, Tristan. Thank you for having me on. As a long time listener, first time caller, it is a real treat to be part of the conversation, and also to see all you're doing, not just to research capital, social capital, but to build it. When Nick Terrell and I write about cyber connecting, it's your kind of Facebook page we have in mind. So thank you for what you're doing to build a social capital community.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew.